Welcome to Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the apocalypse, where we talk about tabletop role-playing games using or inspired by the apocalypse engine. I'm your MC today, Rach, and I'm joined by my guest, Elsa S. Henry of the Feminist Sonar blog. Hi, Elsa. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Fantastic. How long have you been playing Powered by the Apocalypse games, and what was your gateway?
So, I actually haven't been playing them for that long. I'd say probably about, 3 years. The first time I played was a Dungeon World game at Gen Con, of all things. A group of people got together because we'd all been talking about it and joking about what our group of designers would be, and we ended up playing a one-shot at Gen Con, which was great. I was predictably the blind assassin.
That's so cool.
Read a Sitch.
One thing I know that seems to be near and dear to your heart is accessibility in the tabletop role-playing community.
Absolutely, yes. So for those who aren't familiar, I'm a partially deafblind gamer. I don't hear out of one ear unless I'm wearing a hearing aid, and I'm completely blind in one eye. And in addition to that, I wear plus 12 reading glasses. I can't read a pair of dice across the table, which is part of why I really like Powered by the Apocalypse, because it's one of the systems that allows me to do cinematic things without necessarily having to rely on dice all of the time.
In terms of accessibility, do you feel that the accessibility of Powered by the Apocalypse games is often overlooked by other members of the role-playing community?
To an extent. I feel like it's not necessarily the thing that we first think of, but I will say that, I stopped playing D&D when I realized that it was too complicated for me to follow with my sight. And when I played Dungeon World, it was like getting to play D&D again, but it was so boiled down to the parts that I wanted to play that I didn't need to track things on spreadsheets, I didn't need to look something up in a book, I could just look at my playbook. And it really made a difference for me as a gamer to be able to just have everything condensed down.
Is there any particular variants of Powered by the Apocalypse that stand out in having playbooks that are laid out in an especially accessible fashion?
Well, I'm going to do a shameless plug because that was part of how we handled Dead Scare, was that when I was working with Tiara Linagresta, I asked her specifically to make sure that our playbooks were readable for low vision gamers, because I want to be able to play my own game and read it. But I will say that, basically every version that I've played, including Bluebeard's Bride, which is fantastically laid out, as long as it has a one sheet that I can glance at with reasonably large print, it's accessible to me.
Are there any quick tips or tricks that you could share with designers in terms of considerations when you're designing playbooks and paperwork for Powered by the Apocalypse games? Something that might not be intuitive that for you seems like this is central to the accessibility.
Well, okay, so one thing is, anything that has, moves, if you're going to have the moves in a different font from the print that describes the move, you want to make sure that both are readable. Because some of the things that I've seen on some sheets is that the move title is readable, and then the actual move itself, the print, is very tiny, because you want to fit everything onto one page. So I would encourage people to embrace brevity, and really find ways to make your moves punchy and easy to read on the page, because that's what's going to ultimately make it easier for low vision players to enjoy your game. If I have to have large print sheets that are, 3 times the size as everybody else's, that's not going to make it as easy for me to navigate.
And that might end up with a ton of paperwork as well at the table.
Right, and that's what I like about Powered by the Apocalypse games, is that for the most part I've found that they are easy to navigate because there isn't a lot of paperwork. Jason Pitt is currently working on a game called Circles of Power, which I playtested at Metatopia last year, and he's doing a great job of trying to condense things and make them readable, but also making them, come off of the page and be useful at the same time.
When you talk about punchy moves, what sets aside a punchy move in your mind as opposed to a move, what would you call the opposite of that?
Overly explained? So, I've seen moves that are like, these are all of the moving parts for this one thing that you can do. And it's like a really long paragraph. And I often feel like that's a writing skill, of being able to distill your move down to a couple of sentences. It's the difference between, this this is a character who can do forensics. Like, okay, let's take an example. Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes has a move called intuitive deduction. A paragraph version of that move would be written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, would take an enormous amount of space, and would be, in tiny, tiny print. The punchy version of that move is, you can look across a room and see exactly what happened in the span of 50 seconds.
So cut out the flowery writing and get directly to what's actionable about that move.
Exactly, because that's ultimately how your player is going to use it. They're not going to use it as a flowery version, or they might, but they might take their own spin on it. What you're doing as a designer is giving them the tool to do it.
That's something that hadn't occurred to me, because we've done some exploration on the show about how much of the genre is baked into parts of the game, but I think there must be a special art to taking that setting and the important parts of that game and cutting down the word count so it gets right to the point.
I'm a professional writer and editor, that's what I do. So a lot of how I game design is looking at how to get things across to my players. And it's something that took me a really long time to learn, because I too like to be super expansive in my descriptions.
Are there any other neat or compelling thoughts you have about accessibility that most people maybe haven't considered or talked about?
Well, I think another thing that I struggle with a lot is the notion of crosstalk at the table.
Okay.
Because I'm deaf. And so we'll all be playing a game, and somebody will be talking while somebody else is making a move. And that's really distracting for me. And for some people, crosstalk isn't an issue. But if I can't hear the GM, or I can't hear what's happening across the table from me, I can't fully participate in the game. So one of the ways in which I've tried to encourage people to sort of change that is through community storytelling. It's part of why Dead Scare is the kind of game that it is. So later in this episode, we're going to do the section about actual play, but because Dead Scare is a game about coming together and fighting evil, it's hard to do it with two people. Because it's about a neighborhood. It's about people coming together, and you can't crosstalk when everybody is solving a problem.
Yeah, because then no one person is sharing their thought. It's everyone speaking at once.
Right. And it's one of the reasons why I think that Bluebeard's Bride worked really well. Because you're not actually playing separate characters, you're playing different parts of the same person's psyche. So you all have to work together to protect the whole.
I think that's a great segue into our Open Your Brain segment, where we focus specifically on your game, Dead Scare.
Open your brain.
I gave Dead Scare a read over, and what stood out to me was the setting. Can you explain the setting to our listeners?
It is 1953, and you have just woken up. Your children are probably getting ready to go to school, and you turn on the radio. And the president is making an address that we have been attacked by the Soviet Union. And at that point, the president starts making these strange groaning noises. There's a gunshot, and the feed goes dead. What has just happened, for those of you who haven't picked up on the subtle tropes, are zombie apocalypse. So the game is about women in the 1950s living in the suburbs, fighting zombies that came from a Soviet-engineered apocalypse. Welcome to Dead Scare.
I found the detail in the setting particularly fascinating when you're going through and both inverting parts of actual history into this alternate history where this zombie plague attack has been unleashed by the Soviets. What were your favorite parts of that era that you want to include in?
So I'm a historian. My training is in American history. I specifically focused on late 19th century, early 20th century America, and a lot of my work was in obscenity law. And while I was studying obscenity law, I discovered this man named Joseph McCarthy. Now, most of us studied him very briefly if we ever took a class that studied, say, the Crucible. We learned about McCarthyism and the Un-American Activities Committee in Congress, but what I don't think people realize is that he had a lot of power. He did a lot of things that we're still being affected by today. So I decided to make Joseph McCarthy my villain. He's the President of the United States in this scenario. And when I was writing the game, that was the most terrifying thing that I could think of.
The Reconstruction era of the game, where it's after the apocalypse has happened and the player characters have decided what society looks for them now, and then the government comes back, seems horrific.
Yes, because I wanted to talk about what it would have been like if we had had these people who had conservative values. And I want to make something clear, because I'm sure that there are listeners who consider themselves to be conservative. I'm not talking to you. If you believe that people should have freedom of speech, if you believe that people should be able to marry who they want to marry, you're not these people. These are people who want to restrict freedoms, who want to restrict who and what you can be and who and what an American is. And to me, that was something that Joseph McCarthy wanted, and that's something I learned from his historical practices and philosophies. This is the person who put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. So he's had a lot of sort of looming... He exists in our popular cultural memory, even if we don't remember who he is. So I wanted to create a scary place where women and children and people of color and people with disabilities were the ones who needed to be the heroes.
And that's very clear in terms of how the setting portrays the outbreak phase, which is the earlier part of the game, with the cities being targeted with this Soviet attack.
Yep. Well, it also makes a certain amount of sense. If you're going to attack a country that is primarily economically structured around finance and business, you're going to attack the places that have those structures.
So large urban centers, as opposed to the suburbs.
Right. And since this is a time in the United States when men went to work and women stayed home, and it's specifically after the war when women were still in the factories, there's a shift going on. And that shift of sort of women going back into the home is part of what I wanted to talk about. Is a lot of women talked in oral histories about not being able to resettle at home. So I wanted to look at what it would be like if women didn't actually have that time, and what would happen if they were the ones who had to take charge.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, that was one thing that stood out to me when I was reading the different playbooks, is you phrase them in a way that the women were the caretakers, but not necessarily always authority figures in their community before the outbreak occurs.
Absolutely. You're correct. There are some characters who are authority figures who are women, and there are some who are not. And whichever playbook you pick, you might have a different take on it.
Which one of the, particularly the adult women, which I found the most fascinating, is your favorite?
You know, I actually really love The Preacher's Wife.
Oh, it was so cool.
She's one of the playbooks that I really, that was one of the first ones I wrote. Because I was thinking about centers of the community. And when I think about centers of communities in the 1950s, I think about faith centers. But I wanted to make it really clear when I was writing the playbook that you could play a rabbi's wife, preacher's wife, like that's in there. And I've actually run the game as a GM with a GM character who's a rabbi's wife in the past. That's on Critical Role. But I really encourage people to look at that and think about other faiths that could be interpreted through Dead Scare. But the preacher's wife was what I thought was the most sort of blanket term for what it is. But I love her a lot because she's an authority figure, she's a leader. But she also is a leader in a leadership position because of what her husband does in the community.
Yeah, that's what stood out to me was it's phrased in a way that, oh, this is the plus one, as it were, but then you see the community that she's formed around her, and that becomes important in play.
And that's a lot of what the game is about developing community. Or destroying it.
As a healthcare worker, I also liked the nurse who had the option to have come back from the war and is having difficulty readjusting to civilian life.
Mm-hmm. That was really important to me because there's a lot of historical, there are oral histories from women who were nurses in the war who were like, I don't know what to do with myself now that I'm back here and I'm just supposed to stay at home with the kids. Like, I was in the war zone healing people, and now I'm taking my child to preschool. How do I adjust?
There's also the second section of the playbooks, which are the children playbooks.
Yes.
Which one of those was your favorite?
I'm torn on that one, because it's really between the Troublemaker and the Scout. Because the Troublemaker is really fun because they can actually do the most damage. Like, of any of the playbooks, if you want to play this game and destroy a lot of zombies, Troublemaker is probably your best bet. Because the Troublemaker has things like cherry bombs. But on the other hand, if you play the Scout, you actually know how to do things like climb trees and, make campfires, and you might survive slightly longer if you have the Scout, but the Troublemaker is usually the one who blows stuff up.
You could combine them and have the ultimate combat party.
You could. I've actually seen people do that. It's pretty great. During one of the playtests, 2 of my players played twins who were the Troublemaker and the Scout.
Oh no!
Oh yes! I tell this story. It's the only time I've run Dead Scare and I felt bad.
Oh no! What happened?
So, there's a background called the Mini Manhattan Project.
Okay.
You may have noticed it.
Yes, I did.
The kid who won the science fair who knows how to blow things up with chemistry labs.
They did have textbooks that were overly detailed in that era.
They did. And, I had a room full of people who were all playing children. This is really important. 2 of them had the Mini Manhattan Project skill. And they went into, this is a reconstruction game, and they found a zombie farm where the government was testing on them to figure out what exactly they were made of so that they could send it back to where it came from. And the Freedom Scouts decided this was a terrible idea and that they were going to burn the zombie farm down. So, the 2 kids with the Mini Manhattan Project skill put together a bomb. The teacher's pet set up the bomb. And this is where the 2 boxcars were rolled.
Oh no.
Because one of the boxcars was to set up the bomb. The second boxcar was to explode the bomb. And then I had them make a roll to see how well the timer was set up.
Where did that roll come in?
Well, so basically they had to roll to set it up. Like, this is how the bomb is actually put together. And then I had the next person who was cooperating with them roll to see if it would actually explode. Like, are the components correct?
Okay.
But they still had to set up a timer, because they wanted to set up the bomb and have it go off after they left the building. Guess what they rolled on the timer?
Was that the boxcars?
No, that was Snake Eyes.
Oh no. Did they get out in time? What did that look like?
Well, I had to look at the room full of players and say, you have 2 choices. Either I cannot feel like a terrible human and fudge the roll and say it doesn't go off because I don't want to kill a room full of children, or you can all take the roll as is and you all die.
What did they go with?
They all died.
Was it emotionally resonant, though? Did it leave a lasting impression on them?
They were really pleased with themselves because they destroyed the zombie farm and they thwarted the government. And I felt like a terrible human being because I, in the process of writing and running this game, killed a room full of children.
That's a fantastic gaming story. Awful, but fantastic.
Dead Scared, not for the faint of heart.
So beyond the playbooks, what mechanics do you feel are different between your game Dead Scare and the standard apocalypse world?
Well, there are the infection mechanics, which make it possible for you to become a zombie over the course of the game. If you get bitten, you then get an entirely separate playbook, and as your infection progresses, you get more moves. They're zombie moves. Some of them are useful, some of them are not.
What's your favorite of the zombie moves?
I mean, my favorite is probably the first one, which is the one where you can sense the zombies coming, but it doesn't actually infect you. Like, you don't want to eat people. And the second one is that you can tell when they're coming, but you kind of want to eat everyone around you. By the end of it, you're basically ready to munch on everyone, and you can only use your moves if you eat everyone. It gets pretty grisly. But what I like about it is that there are consequences. If you choose to continue allowing the infection to take over in order to do things like sense where the Zeds are, you're doing something that's good for your community by knowing where the Zeds are, and being able to, like, talk to them and move through them and do all of these other things, but you're also putting your community in more and more danger as you do it. And I think it sets up a really interesting dynamic for players who get infected.
Yeah, because you're useful, but you're also posing this interesting risk to the rest of the party.
And it raises questions of how long can you let this go on for before the party ultimately decides that you're too much of a risk? Or will you, make that choice for them?
Have you seen that choice come up in play at all?
Unfortunately, I haven't gotten to run any of the campaigns. So I usually run this game as like a one-shot at a convention. So I've only seen it run sort of in a short term, when it's a quick progression. But I'd be really interested to hear from people who played it as a campaign, to see how it goes when it's a campaign sort of slow burn. So I'm sure that would be really interesting to watch.
It is time to act under fire.
So our final segment is Act Under Fire, where we explore part of the game and play. And Elsa, you said you wanted to go through the neighborhood building part of the game together tonight.
So, because this is one thing that I can sort of do in my sleep, as it were. This is the thing that I think I put the most thought into for this game, because I wanted people to have the experience of creating their own neighborhood. So, the first question that I usually ask people is, what kind of a neighborhood is it? Where is it? Like, is it near New York? Is it near Chicago? Is it near Boston, Philadelphia? Where is it in the context of places that got the Z virus?
Let's go with Boston. I got a little bit of experience with Boston from role-playing.
Great. So, Boston. Boston gets sort of zombified. Are there train stations where you live?
There must be. I imagine this would be a suburb and people would take the train in to get into work downtown every day.
So, we'll call it Braintree, because brains. So Braintree is a bit south of Boston, and you can take the commuter rail in and out. Based on that, I'm assuming what kinds of things are in your town. Is there a church? What kind of schools are there? Do you walk to school?
Oh, it's definitely, there's a church, very prominent one, down, not quite downtown, like on the main street. Like downtown would be overselling it. But we have a church, and most respectable members of the community go there. Mm-hmm. It's in walking distance, unless you're one of the outliers. Very small parking lot. Mm-hmm. I think the schools must be walkable, because that's part of the American dream, right? Being able to walk your children to school every day?
Yeah. And, what are the parks like? Like, where do kids go to play?
We have a beautiful park in the shadow of the school. So it's on the recess grounds, but this is almost out in the country, so there's not a lot of asphalt. There's nice rolling hills and maybe a forest on the edge of the property. Of course, the kids don't go in the forest during recess, or at least that's what the teachers tell them.
Sure. Let's just say that, like, there's somebody built a tree house in the forest, because that's interesting and creepy, and possibly a place that one could set some kind of zombie battle, not that we're counting. So where do the adults go during the day when their kids are in school? Where do the women go? Is there a quilting bee or some kind of community service?
Well, given the church is a big part of the community, I think there is a community service that actually serves mostly as a social gathering. Mm-hmm. We could say that we went off and did our community service, but we're actually going and networking and chatting. Occasionally we'll maybe do a fundraiser, and we'll set up, arrange a bake sale to go off during some point in the summer on a Sunday during church. You can get some snacks in and out. That requires a lot of prep work, right?
What would you say are the weaknesses of the community? Specifically on your street, is there anybody who doesn't get along with everybody else? Is there somebody who just doesn't mow their lawn or isn't very nice to the children?
Oh, there's definitely Miss Thomas. We don't know where she goes on Sundays. We definitely see her during the week. We'll see her in the grocery store doing her shopping. But on the Sundays, she's nowhere to be found. And there's a lot of rumors about where she actually is.
Gotcha. Interesting. So if things were to happen, would she be on your team, or would you not let her into the circle?
I think she has to show us what she could provide to the circle. And if she could come to an agreement, of course, we wouldn't change, she would have to change, right?
Sure. So this is the point as a GM where I would give Miss Thomas a bunker.
Give her some leverage?
Yeah, that would interest me. Or I'd give her zombies in her closet, I don't know. This is sort of how the community building works. We try to sort of build a vivid place where characters live, so that by the time we start the game, there's gossip, which is a mechanic. It's like strings and conditions, but the way that it works is a social capital.
Oh yes, I remember that. Could you explain it in a little bit more detail?
So, you basically have something on everybody else at the table, and they have something on you. But they also have nice things to say about you, because that's how the community works, and you can spend that social capital by outing them, or by using that information to get what you want. And it's basically, that's how gossip works, is it's social capital instead of strings.
Yeah, it's like, well, I've got dirt on you, so unless you want that dirt to be out in public, you better go along with my plan.
And sometimes the dirt is completely innocuous. I've had somebody literally be the person who didn't rake their leaves in the fall, and that was the dirt that we had on them, but it made everybody super angry.
Well, the neighborhood association claims that you have to have your leaves raked, a certain amount of hours after they fall to the grass, right?
Yes, exactly. And what I like about it is, this is sort of something I guess I could have also said at the beginning, but there's a dial here. We could have taken the dial to a different place. The dial can sometimes be leave it to beaver meets zombies, which is more of what we're going for here. Sometimes you crank the dial all the way to 11, and it's like, this is where the black people live, and this is where the Jews live, and this is the situation that we're in 1950. Before civil rights movements, before the Americans with Disabilities Act, we are playing this on the hardcore historical setting. Ow, everything hurts.
This side of the street is a type of person's neighborhood, and they don't go to the other side of the street because, well, that's unspoken of. You would never think of doing that.
This game can be played on a dial from light to dark, and it can be humorous, and it can be super intense. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote it the way that I did.
To allow for that flexibility, just in case someone doesn't want to take it to that hardcore history level.
Also because not everybody wants to play in a game where all of the children die.
Well, unless they've accidentally botched their roll. I mean, it seemed like a good plan at the time, right?
And this is when everyone clutches the X card with glee.
So, Elsa, it's been fantastic talking to you tonight. Where can people find you and your game online?
You can find Dead Scare at deadscare.com, and you can find me at Snarkbat on Twitter.
Fantastic. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Plus One Forward is a production of the Gauntlet community, Richard Rogers and Rach Shelkey. You can find us at gauntlet-rpg.com or follow us on Twitter at +1FWD. If you would like to support our show, visit our Patreon site at patreon.com/gauntlet. The games mentioned on this show use the Apocalypse engine, which is a creation of Vincent and Magay Baker. The music for Plus One Forward is from the Savage Aural Hotbed CD Gomi Daiko. The songs used are Gomi Daiko, Metal Version, and Drowning Attitude. You can find more amazing tunes by Savage Aural Hotbed on their website, www.savageauralhotbed.com.